Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're dialing in from, and welcome to today's webcast brought to you by Opus and Ethisphere. I'm Arti Maharaj, and I'll be hosting this webcast. Today's topic is risk as a team sport, managing key enterprise risk across functions. For this webcast, we're scheduled to go for 1 hour. I'm going to give a brief introduction, and then we'll jump right into the presentation in partnership with Opus. Throughout this webcast, we welcome you to interact with our panel via the question function located on your screen. Following this presentation, participants will receive an exclusive copy of the Opus and Ethisphere special report, which features contributions by leaders from Nokia, On Semiconductor, Granite Construction, Millicom, and more. So stay tuned for that copy of the report after the presentation. So now on to today's webcast. Please welcome Manny Conti, Chief Executive Officer at Opus, and Ethisphere's Executive Director of the Business Ethics Leadership Alliance, Erica Salmon-Byrne. We're glad to have you both here. Manny, how about you start with giving us a little bit of background into your role at Opus?
Well, thank you, Artie. So my name is Manny Conti. I've been the CEO of Opus for a couple years, and with that, I have many responsibilities. Obviously, responsible for the strategic direction of the business, but as CEO, ultimately responsible for risk and compliance.
Thanks for that, Manny. And Erica, can you provide some background into your role as well at Ethisphere?
Sure, absolutely. And good morning or good afternoon, everybody, depending on where you're located. Delighted to have a chance to be with you all today and to talk through the conversation around risk management as a team sport. As Artie mentioned, I'm the executive director of BELA, which is our Business Ethics Leadership Alliance. I also run the data and services team here at Ethisphere. And so during the course of today's presentation, I'll be sharing some data from the work that we do here at Ethisphere, helping companies measure and mitigate risk, design best-in-class ethics and compliance programs, and measure their culture effectively. Manny and I will be sharing some insights on the variety of different ways that individuals across an organization can work together to more effectively triangulate their control data and really get a good picture of what's happening across the organization.
Great, thank you both for that introduction. Just to set some context into today's discussion, as we know in today's day and age where people are increasingly skeptical about the business environment, risk management has become a vital component of any business. So minor missteps are often elevated to major challenges. So it is essential that all businesses stress interdepartmental collaboration to mitigate potential risk. So with that in mind, let's focus a bit on the theme of collaboration. And this is where I'll toss it over to you, Manny. In your view, why is collaboration so important today, and also why more important now than ever?
Oh, certainly. Well, look, I think many of us realize that risk manifests itself in many ways across many functions, and it seems to find all the seams and cracks in our organizations. And what I think the other dynamic is that various risk domains are becoming increasingly specialized. So cyber risk is a very complicated and technical skill. Privacy, very domain requires a lot of domain expertise. Anti-bribery and corruption, same thing. So even if organizationally you had one risk organization, which oftentimes is not the case, but even if you did, the domain expertise requires specialization and therefore requires collaboration by its nature. I have one, short story in that in prior life, we had an issue that we identified a potential human safety issue. So that would require a specific type of risk expertise. But what we quickly realized as we started to investigate it happened to be a fraud that was happening right underneath our noses. So it had nothing to do with human safety, but it started off that way. But if we didn't have a multidisciplinary team that was investigating the matter, we never really would have uncovered it. So I think there are many, many examples that demonstrate the need to have deep expertise in a variety of different risk domains, and those teams have to collaborate to effectively mitigate the risk.
Archie, if I could hop in here with a question that I
Absolutely.
have for Manny. And those of you who have heard me do webcasts here at Ethisphere before know that I have a tendency to interrupt myself and also interrupt the other presenters, and also to pull questions from the floor. So if you have particular questions that you'd like to ask either myself or Manny, please send them in. Archie and I are monitoring the chat function. Manny, how is this different from in years past? What do you think has been sort of the driving factor behind this concept of collaboration? Because, I've been in the space for a long time. You've been in the space for a long time. For many years, audit and compliance or information security and compliance were not natural partners.
Yeah, well, I think the reality is that the prominence of risk management is making its way to the board level. While it was always a governance issue, I think the stakes are much higher. I think as we've seen, like with prominent data breaches, it's hurting the reputation of boards. It is disrupting companies' revenues, and that's making its way up to the board level. And I think as they start to unpeel all of this, they're starting to see that if you bolster any one function or any one dimension of risk, it's unsatisfactory. So I just think that the boards are getting much more sophisticated, asking many more questions, and it's requiring the organization to move beyond just typically, at least in my own experience, typically, it used to just rest on internal audit, and that's a big burden for internal audit to own, enterprise risk on their own.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I would agree with that. I mean, I think one of the things that I find so interesting about where the space is right now is this growing recognition amongst audit professionals, compliance and ethics professionals, that there are so many overlapping data points that can be informative to them as a team, because it's very rare, as the example you just used, Manny, with the health and safety violation, it's very rare to find a situation where you have an issue in just one place. If you've got a spike of safety issues, chances are good you've got a spike of T&E issues, or it's compliance and safety and audit. These are all sides of the same coin.
Precisely, and I think most teams that get into investigations, you quickly start to figure out it's multidimensional, and as you start to pull those threads, you tend to bring in more expertise, and so yeah, I think this is something that most of the people on the phone are dealing with every day. I think boards, given their governance role and responsibilities, are becoming more and more aware of this dynamic, and are beginning to act because they're being held responsible.
Great, thank you for that, Manny. And I just want to pause for a moment here, as one question came in from a member of the audience. And once again, we'd like to encourage participants to send in their questions using the chat function below. So one question came in on the value of leadership, and this can both, Erica and Manny, you can both answer this question. Leaders are in a position where they can shape a company's culture. So with that, how should C-level leaders make sure others across a company are aware of these risks and challenges that you highlighted?
Yeah, it's an excellent question, and the reality is that tone at the top is an important item that boards are highly aware of. They recognize that if leaders, the executive management team, is not owning and feeling that they're accountable to driving appropriate risk management, then really the rest is for naught. And so it certainly starts with the leadership team. And there's a few things that they can do. Certainly the way they behave, obviously, is important. The values that they adhere to themselves and hold accountable their teams is important. And then the processes they put in place. I mean, look, we're very accustomed in business as leaders to hold leaders accountable for specific outcomes, whether it be sales, profitability, et cetera. Well, the same can be true around risk management. And so having dashboards, making it clear about what are the controls that they're going to have in place and how they're going to measure those controls, and the fact that they're looking and going to report, I think really shapes, it sends the right message and shapes behavior appropriately.
Yeah, Manny, I agree 100%. Here at Ethisphere, we're fond of saying that what gets measured gets done. And so I think, putting in place metrics, making it clear that you're going to hold people to those metrics, having consequences when those metrics are not met or are not reported on. The other thing from a cultural perspective to think about is that the sort of the three levers you can pull on to influence a culture are who you hire, who you fire, and who you promote. And that third one is a place for, I think, for leaders to put some thought, because for many years, people are promoted to positions based on the results that they achieve, and not necessarily on how they achieve those results. And so if, risk mitigation and thinking about risk in a more systematic way is something that is proving of value to the company, making that a part of the promotion analysis as you think about who moves up the ladder across the organization, that's one extremely effective way to send a message.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Erica. And I would say, I would build on it as well. Risk management isn't a separate function from the rest of the business. It's really the flip side of the same coin of companies pursuing business opportunities. So, if companies want to pursue growth, they certainly look at emerging markets, whether it be in Southeast Asia, et cetera. And of course, those jurisdictions have risks. So it's not simply trying to mitigate the risks. They're looking to, pursue opportunities that they think are worth it. And so now they're trying to figure out how can we best mitigate the risks. And the ones that do have competitive advantage. So risk management in many ways is a great business practice that can create sustained advantage. I think of the one case study, and there are many, but Coca-Cola entered the Chinese market multiple times, failed multiple times, and then finally figured out, no pun intended, the formula by which they could operate effectively. And with that, they're a market leader in the Chinese market. Few U.S. companies have been able to achieve such impressive dominance in that marketplace. But you really have to think about it in both ways. As a CEO myself, we recognize that by pursuing these opportunities, the only way we can successfully do that is manage those risks. So as we think about, as you said, what we measure ultimately is what shapes the behavior of the company. Thinking about both of those dimensions, managing the opportunities and the risks at the same time, and connecting that for people, I think is really important. Because I think companies run into trouble when they think about risk as a separate function and not connected to the rest of the organization and its goals and objectives.
Yeah, and Manny, you touched on risk management outside a company. Let's talk about third parties for a minute here. And Erica as well, what advice do you have for managing risk that are not under your direct control?
Well, third parties represent they represent not only a significant risk, but it's a multidimensional risk. And so I think most risk professionals know this, but just a few facts. I think over 50, we conducted a study with Kahneman in which we found that over 56% of breaches were occurred with a third party. 75% of anti-bribery and corruption issues originated with a third party. So they represent a risk to the organization that oftentimes doesn't fit into one function. So it's really important to be able to think about them holistically and begin to evaluate all the risks at the third party level as opposed to any one function trying to assess the risk, because they'll all have their own lens. So that's the first point. The second is that, the data on companies in general, almost a third of the data becomes obsolete and incorrect every year. So simple identification and the management of who they are and what they do for you constantly is changing. So it's really important to get your arms around identity. And so who are they? Making sure that you have clarity around that. And it sounds easy, but how many CRM systems do large organizations have? It's not one. Or how many master vendor files does a company have? It's often more than one. So it's really starts with clarity around identity and having a true, vendor view of, one vendor view or vendor file, and then evaluating the risk of that entity comprehensively. So that's how I think about third party. It's multidimensional, and we, at Opus, have that approach. We think of third parties as a risk in it itself, and then try to evaluate all the risks at the same time on what they could represent to us as a company.
Yeah, and I would agree with everything that Manny just said, RT. I would add a couple of things. Think about not just your third-party universe from a data perspective, right? There's the data that you collect on your third parties and how quickly that can go out of date. And part of the reason for that is your third parties are changing just as fast as you are, right? So making sure that as part of your process, there's a continuous understanding not only of your business and the risk, the changing risk profile as you launch a product line, discontinue a product line, go into a market, leave a market. All of those pieces have a tremendous impact on your risk profile. And they also have an impact on your third parties. And so, for many years, I think a lot of companies had sort of this laser focus on understanding who their third parties were when they were onboarded, right? So who am I bringing into my system? It's a new vendor. Let's make sure my new vendor controls are great. I understand who this vendor is. I understand their beneficial ownership. I understand all these pieces. And then that was kind of it, right? You brought them into the system, and then they were in the system, and the business relationship continued, and you didn't spend a lot of time thinking about that third party. Well, over the course of time, that third party changes tremendously as an organization. They could get sold, they could get bought, there's tons of things that could happen with that third party. And so that process of continuous monitoring of the data around those third parties and the access it has to that third party has to your system, the information they're providing you, the work they're doing for you, that's all critically important. The flip side of that is your employees understanding why third parties are a risk. So we spend a lot of time talking to companies here about telling the why behind the rules, as opposed to just saying to a third party or to your employee who's working with a third party, here's the onboarding process, go make them do it. Take the time to make sure your employees understand why you're asking for what you're asking for, right? Give the purpose behind the process. Because if you do that, then if you've got a good employee, a smart employee, someone using the judgment for which you hired them in the first place, that third party can then help you effectively keep an eye, or that employee rather, can help you effectively keep an eye on that third party. Because your employees, your frontline employees, the ones that are interacting with your third parties on a day-to-day basis, they're often your best line of defense against third-party issues. So you can have great monitoring systems, but if your employees interacting with the business partner don't understand why you have the gifts and entertainment rules that you have, then you can wind up finding yourself in trouble pretty quickly.
Right. And Erica, one question came in here from an audience member, and it's if there's an issue in one place, it is likely that there are also issues occurring elsewhere. Is there a list of examples of these risk interdependencies?
How long do you have? Yeah, and it varies by business. I raised that point, sort of this idea that if you've got a manager that's ignoring the process in one place, the chances are good that he or she is ignoring the process in another place, right? And so, thinking about the type of risks that you're reviewing and the ways in which your people are going to potentially be getting you into trouble with those risks. So what you see here on the slide in front of you, and thank you for advancing to this, what you see here on the slide in front of you is an answer to one of the questions that we ask as part of our ethics quotient process. And that is, as part of your risk assessment process, what kinds of, whether a standalone ethics and compliance risk assessment or as part of a broader ERM process, what sorts of risks are you looking at? And so if you think about some of these things, financial integrity and fraud, for example. If you've got a manager that has found a workaround around some of those processes, do you think he or she's going to stop at financial, at sort of minor level fraud, or are they also rounding up their cab receipts? So it's this idea that and I call this triangulation of control data. It's this idea that if you treat risk mitigation as a team sport, and you take the time to develop a good working relationship with audit and information security and health and safety and physical security if you have a physical security group, or loss prevention if you have a loss prevention group, and human resources, and you look at the dashboards that each one of those groups have of the places where they see trends and issues, the chances are you're going to see some pretty significant overlap. And so it's this idea of figuring out where in your business are different data sources on employee misconduct, process failures, etc. And what can that data layered on top of each other, what can it tell you about where your key risks lie?
Right. Manny, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure if the question was narrow or broad, but I'll answer it a bit more narrowly, because what we're seeing in the marketplace and what we see even internally is that there's a real convergence in cyber risk and data privacy. And so if you're dealing with a vendor or a third party of some kind, and you're finding that the controls associated with cyber are weak, you're going to expose yourself to privacy issues as well. And so there's a lot of interdependencies between those two. And I also find that financial integrity and brand reputation are also another highly correlated. You start to rely on small companies that perhaps are not disclosing their financials appropriately, likely could mean, perhaps shortcomings in other aspects that could then affect your brand. So those are two particular areas that we've started to see, convergence of particular risk domains.
Mm-hmm. And since we're on the point of cyber risk and data privacy, Manny, the Chief Information Security Officer is another key risk management function. And I know for sure it's one that Opus has a lot of experience with. Can you talk about some of the hurdles they are facing today, and how do these challenges overlap with compliance and other roles?
Well, I think, we've done some studies here. Their biggest hurdle is actually a labor shortage. There's a significant labor shortage in the world right now because I mentioned that there were certain domains that just require expertise, and all of them do, but cyber in particular, it's very technical, and you're just not finding the labor force growing at a fast enough rate to meet these growing demands. So our clients are really looking for ways to not only recruit talented people, but looking for automation and ways by which they can get a force multiplier effect for their people. And we happen to build products in those domains, but that, I would say, is one of the biggest areas that they're struggling with. Now, the manifestation of this labor shortage means they're just not evaluating enough of their third parties sufficiently that is consistent with the policies they have, which is what's driving them to find alternative ways by which they can solve it. And the only other thing I would say is, because of this, it's a very strong organization in most companies, right? They have a CISO, or a Chief Information Security Officer, oftentimes at the top of the house, but they're going to have to interact with others. Data privacy, such as GDPR, often falls under the GC. But as I mentioned, CISOs have a big role in helping uncover, privacy issues. So there are multiple examples of how CISOs have to integrate with, the rest of risk and compliance. But I would say, if I had to rank, their biggest challenges, I think the labor shortage that exists right now is one of the top priorities they have in trying to figure out how to solve.
Right. And Erica, I know right now in the news, there are a lot of high profile departures happening where the CISO is going to leave because he voiced concerns around the need for transparency. How should executives voice concerns do you think when they see issues in their core field? And how do you get people to align these visions?
Yeah, it's a really good question, RT. And I think one of the things that companies need to think about is they need to figure out how to address this at a non-crisis time, right? So there certainly are some very high-profile examples of CISOs either leaving companies right now, or recent examples of CISOs that have left, sort of post an issue. And I think it goes to this idea that we need to plan for these things during the good times. So having a strong risk management process, having a board and a management team that are aligned on risk appetite, making sure that people are all kind of in a place where they can think about risk and systemic risk to the business and reputation risk broadly and with some room, so that when they do find themselves in a crisis, that everyone is responding sort of in line. Thinking through, crisis response plans, who's going to tweet what, for example, right? What is our, bad news breaks on Friday, what's our over the weekend response plan to make sure that, everybody is giving authentic responses, but everybody is giving responses that are in line with each other. Those are conversations that are much easier to have when you don't have reporters calling your phone constantly. And companies are increasingly doing those sort of, desktop exercises, right? Let's talk through what will happen when, this issue comes up. And I can't recommend those kind of exercises highly enough, right? It definitely is something that you have to think about, but it really all goes back to a solid risk assessment process and thinking through, what am I looking at? What am I thinking about? And actually, if we can hop ahead to the next slide, looking at the leading company practices, the diversity of inputs that go into a solid risk assessment process is another key component of this. So look at trends, right? I mean, look at what's coming. What kind of questions are you getting asked? What sort of things are coming up on investor calls? Again, this comes down really to the theme of this webcast, which is this idea that it's a team sport. We've got to pull everything together and we've got to think about things holistically, because if we don't do that, then we have these sort of one-off processes running in a ton of different directions, and it becomes extremely difficult to manage.
Yeah, I completely agree. I've lived through a couple data breaches, and it's always better to be proactive than reactive, and these desktop sessions can help you prepare for that. I would say that if you are in a crisis, whatever early information you have, just know it's incomplete. And we see this play out in the press over and over again. A lot of notable breaches even this past year, where they start to try to frame the facts, and then ultimately they're forced to reframe the facts because they're getting new information. And so you just got to realize that early in a crisis probably don't know a whole lot, no matter what the early indication is. I would say, though, that, I think the question was around, what should executives do? And I think they really need to be close to their, security teams. And they can be close to them in a variety of ways. One is, and something we do, is we hold frequent meetings scheduled that reviews the activities around prevention, the things that we are detecting, and what we are doing from a response perspective. So we get into a cadence about what is it that we deal with, and most importantly, showing the security team that the management team cares. What are you living through? What are your constraints? What do you need to be more proactive in securing our assets? And these relationships matter, and it sends a very strong signal to them that they're important. And I think when these functions become too disconnected from leadership and management, it's very easy for it to become academic, and somebody might feel that one cares, people don't care. And I think we've seen some, recent departures and people just disagreeing on the importance of their area of domain. So I think it's really important that leadership stays close to risk management and obviously, on the information security side.
Mm-hmm. And Manny, to your point earlier, do you have any thoughts on how much time should they meet? Should they meet bi-weekly, quarterly?
Well, I think every organization can figure that out. I mean, we meet monthly, but anytime there's certain events, we meet immediately if it rises to a particular threshold. Obviously, you hope that's not too frequent, but you need to make them aware that in that event that it meets a particular threshold, and we have some definitions around that then we are called immediately and we'll have an emergency session. But on a normal cadence around our program and how we're progressing, we happen to meet monthly. I don't know, Erica, if you have best practices around that, but that's what I've done, and that's what I do here and what I've done in prior life.
Yeah, monthly is pretty consistent with what we see in the data, Manny, when we look at sort of the frequency with which internal committees get together to have these risk conversations. It's definitely, you want to have at least a regular meeting on the calendar where you're going to have the opportunity to talk to your critical partners. It's going to vary by company. It's going to vary by culture. Some companies are very meeting happy. Some companies are, sort of trending away from lots of large meetings. But understanding that, sort of how you're going to be communicating about this process, and then having, just as you said, certain thresholds, certain triggers, where if certain things happen, everybody gets together, right? Everybody gets a call. Everybody figures out how they're going to respond. Everybody knows whose responsibility it is to call whom, right? I was talking to one client a couple of weeks ago, and they had an issue come up. And they realized it was a multidisciplinary issue. So they had information security and loss prevention and human resources and compliance all involved in the conversation about what had happened and what they were going to do about it. They realized they had never designated a certain person to call the CEO. So they were all sort of sitting in the meeting going, are you going to do that? Am I going to do that? Who's going to do that? And it was a piece of the process that they had missed out on. And so thinking through, sort of those, not only the triggers of when your group is going to talk through an issue, but whose responsibility it is to escalate it to whom, so that you can have faith that it's been escalated properly.
Mm-hmm. And Erica, you raise a very valid point into who should you take it to next. So this question is more an organization structure. Does that matter in these cases? And can you offer any best practices, or is it by company? I
think the most important thing is figuring out who it is that's going to raise it. There are certain things where you want to have the conversation potentially have the shield of the privilege, depending on the issue. So that may counsel getting the general counsel or somebody on their staff involved, especially if it's in the US where the in-house counsel privilege applies. If you're outside the US where the in-house counsel privilege doesn't apply, then you have to have your triggers of when you're going to involve counsel in certain conversations. All of those things are going to factor into kind of who the right person is to make the phone call. Mm-hmm. But the important thing is, while you have the leisure time to figure that out, that you actually take the time to do that. And that you understand kind of all of those different kind of key components of the communication process. What time, when are you going to get comms involved? All of those pieces, because if you don't have that multidisciplinary, multifaceted conversation, then you're going to find yourself scrambling when you do have that issue. Manny, I don't know if you have any other thoughts on that, but
yeah, I mean, it's definitely multidimensional. And I would say that what's interesting is where companies sometimes trip up is they don't realize they have customer contracts that have different thresholds than internal thresholds, and that's a problem. So you have to understand that when you think about your communications, oftentimes companies know about the regulatory requirements, right? Those, even though there's gray, you'll get a lot of legal advice around if you have to inform a particular regulator. but oftentimes they don't have visibility into all the customer contracts they've signed, and sometimes there is notifications that are more, might be stricter than the policy you have. So I would just say that you make sure you get your arms around that, because that should be well understood. And the reason I raise it is that it's not only could it damage a customer a customer relationship you have, but that customer could be regulated by an entity that is putting those demands on them. And so you could put them in a really tough spot if you don't inform and notify them appropriately. So just another thing to look out for.
Mm-hmm. And I wanted to touch on the report for a bit here. And one of the consistent themes from all of the contributors in this special report is that communication is critical to effectively managing risk, and also ensuring that nothing falls through the cracks. What are some ways, Manny, in your view, that you're seeing individual leaders or departments communicate their challenges across a company?
Well, I think having a standardized process, not only in terms of how information is collected, but also how risks are scored, I think really helps in the communication. So, somebody thinking, a risk is adequate or not adequate, if the definitions are different, that can make it very difficult. So I think process and definitions goes a long way. And then I think, creating reporting or dashboards that everybody can see. It's hard to have a conversation, let's say you do have a steering committee, but you can't quite show all the multiple dimensions of a particular third party's risk without, reporting on it in some way. So we see the companies that are most successful have clarity on process, clarity around definitions, and they have clear reporting, mechanisms by which they share information.
Mm-hmm. Erica?
Yeah, Artie, if I could just jump in on that, because I think that's a really critically important piece of this. We have a lot of companies that we work with, so for everybody else that's listening in on this to feel a little bit of comfort. We have a number of companies that we work with on a regular basis, and Manny, I'm sure you see the same thing, that have legacy IT systems that are not integrated. They're operating on 4 HRIS systems or 5 HRIS systems. They're operating on, 3 different, mail systems in some cases. They've got multiple due diligence systems due to acquisition. So we know it's not easy to figure out how to report on all of this, but it is critically important. So thinking through those places where you can most easily get consistent data easily, right? So whether it's your case management system, for example, can you get health and safety and compliance and human resources on one consistent case management system so that you can get trending information on employee activity patterns easily? And then can you cross that with information that IT can get from login activities? So who's trying to engage in inappropriate systems access, or in what places are you seeing folks click on phishing emails? Things like that. Start with the things that you can overlap from wherever you are technologically. But I think it's important to acknowledge that a lot of the folks on the line are dealing with multiple legacy systems that are not always compatible with each other.
Yeah, no, it's so true. And it's one of the reasons why, even the way we sell our products, we of course developed software by which, you can automate these workflows that we've described. But one of the capabilities that we built was the ability to take disparate pieces of information. If you have fragmented databases, as a risk professional, it won't happen in our time frame by which those will all be centralized. So how do you just take all those different files and create a master file? And that's something we do at the beginning of these projects, and then it can be done on an ongoing basis. So you don't have to go through large, system integration projects that can just take, so very long, and may not even be economical. So we lead with, our initiatives to integrate that content and then put it into the workflow so they can get to work.
Right, and I want to pause for a minute again here and take in a question from the audience. We've spoken in general terms around how executives should work together. Could you talk a little bit more on the key risk you're seeing for the role of the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer, and have these risks changed in recent years?
I assume that I'm going to assume the question is about the risk that they're dealing with, not the risk to the person. So just to be clear, so I think over recent times we see a major increase in cybersecurity risk, and it's evolving. So even though we've seen the headlines in the news for some time now, it's actually accelerating. There's more attacks that are happening, this year than they happened last year. And the budgets of companies to respond to that and the labor shortage that exists today is just being, is making this problem get more and more. So I think, chief compliance officers are becoming, more reliant on and collaborating with CISOs than ever before. And I don't see that stopping. And so I guess the question is practically, how do you do it? I think the only way to do it, quite frankly, is twofold. Meetings by which those two groups can get together and define what the risks are. I tend to like to use controls, establish controls. Ultimately, that's what's going to go to the board. Every enterprise risk management, program will have controls framework. And once you align on what those controls are and what you're going to report on, you can then define what defines, a material weakness or not. And then try to aggregate the risks across different functions and share it on a monthly or bi-monthly basis.
Yeah, I would agree with that, RT. And the thing I would add, it's interesting. In the special report, Jeff Eglash over at Nokia talked about perennial challenges, and I do think that the format or the method of the challenge has changed, but one of the perennial challenges that will always be with us is that at the end of the day, what all of this is trying to mitigate people-created risk, right? In our legal system, in every legal system, there's a function of the corporation as a legal fiction, right? It can sue, it can be sued, it can do stuff, it can enter into contracts, but it can't actually do anything. It requires a principal-agent relationship with all of its employees and its third parties out there doing things on its behalf. And at the end of the day, that's really what all of this goes back to, right? So if you look, for example, at Manny's breach and cybersecurity example, most of what that is that's employees doing things they're not supposed to be doing on company systems, right? Just like anti-corruption, for the most part, is employees doing things they're not supposed to be doing in conversations or in interactions with government officials. Every one of the significant risk areas that a chief ethics and compliance officer is charged with mitigating, at the end of the day, it comes down to people-created risk. And so I agree with Manny that controls are important, and thinking through your control framework is important, and understanding what triggers are where and what's going to get reported on. But, starting from that place of what we need to do is we need to get to our employees and help them understand why they shouldn't do certain things, and make sure that the processes we put in place are not structured in such a way as to get in the way of them being able to do their jobs. Because if we do that, then they're going to find workarounds, right? So that's the mindset from my perspective, and part of the reason why this team sport framework for this, or metaphor for this, is so important, because you're all coming together at the end of the day with this idea that we're trying to mitigate people-created risk. We're trying to get to our folks with the information that they need before they do something stupid.
Mm-hmm. And Erica, with that, how should leaders consume that information that's given to them from other departments, so that they are aware of the specific risk?
It's relationship building. honestly, right? It's understanding what, helping people understand how to talk to you about what they're seeing, and understanding where the data that they're coming to you with is where is it coming from, and sort of where is it being produced from, what are the inherent limitations on the systems that data has come from. But at the end of the day, it's so much of this comes down to relationship building across functions, and really understanding, as somebody presenting to an executive team member, understanding what they are looking for and need to know from your information. And then as an executive, what is it that I need to understand about the information that's being presented to me? And that's something I can really only get by developing a relationship with the person who's bringing the information.
Mm-hmm. Manny, any thoughts on relationship building or any trends you've seen?
Well, I think I don't think there's any magic in relationship building. I mean, we in our normal course of business, whether if you're running sales, you have to build relationships with your marketing partners and your product teams, and vice versa. I think the same is here, and I think just getting an understanding of what who they are, how best can they help each other, and establishing that, and understanding each other's own challenges, I think goes a long way. And the only other dimension I put on this, since I think the person who asked the original question, came from an ethics and compliance perspective, if you believe the stats that I'm talking about around there's a severe labor shortage in cyber, you then have to wonder how that, internally within your organization, what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of quality? Like if I told you that, you were in a, you had a manufacturing facility and you were short safety personnel, that might trigger certain, red flags for you to investigate, or ensure that the team members there feel open to discuss perhaps possible shortcomings. I think the same could be applied here as well. If you're in one of those roles, how do those teams really feel, being understaffed, and is anything being shortchanged? You'd rather know that up front than later.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Manny, in the interest of time, we also received another question here. We spoke a lot about compliance risks throughout this webcast, and one final question to you is on the topic of audit. What are some key risks that you're seeing today?
Just key risks in general?
In general, yeah, as it relates to the audit function.
Yeah, well, I think the biggest risk for audit, I was just met with one of my clients who heads internal audit. Their biggest risk is actually gathering all the information, making sure they have transparency, because they're dealing with so many functions. They all have disparate platforms. They're trying to get everybody to have one risk management platform, but for them, they can't drive that requirement. So they're trying to aggregate it, and they're just finding that the task is actually pretty overwhelming because nothing is standardized. And so I think for an internal audit, their biggest risk is not really having a full picture of those risks. And oftentimes, especially if you're in a public company, they're having to report to the audit committee every quarter and report on the ERM progress. And I think they feel a lot of stress and strain in terms of just gathering information and ensuring they have transparency. So for that person, it's really important to have good relationships and really establish good standards and definitions around the controls and the reporting.
Mm-hmm. And I know we're jumping around here a little bit, and now I have a question on culture that came in from the audience. And this one is specifically for you, Erica. Do you think that it's fair to say that a major hurdle to making real progress on these multiple realities is employee fear, nature to not care, afraid to approach management or executives? Why is this so important, and how can one get the right people to actually do something and be proactive versus reactive?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question, RT, and you know, it's something that we spend a lot of time looking at here. So the person asking the question from the floor is absolutely right that, you know, if we think about all of this as people created risk, then what you really need is you need people asking questions or raising their hand early enough for you to do something about the risk. And one of the major reasons that people don't raise their hand, if you look at our survey data, one of the major reasons people don't raise their hand is that they are afraid of the consequences of speaking up, or they don't think anything would happen, right? So it's really interesting from my perspective. Our survey data is now tied, that fear of retaliation and nothing would happen, so why bother, are the two most common reasons that employees give for not raising a concern or not saying something when they saw something. Both of those are something that companies can do something about, right? So communication to managers in particular, right? So if you think about all of the work that we do to get people to ask questions, your manager is the most natural place for you to go with all your questions, right? Am I doing, you know, I've got a question about this client contract. I've got a question about this particular engagement. I've got a question about something that's going on, you know, with a colleague. I've got a question about a vendor offering me tickets to a ball game. All those things are very natural questions for an employee to take to their manager, but most managers are poorly prepared to take those questions. So if you think about this from a risk perspective, if I'm a manager, and you know, especially a relatively new manager, most companies do a poor job preparing managers to manage, right? You get a 1-hour course on how to approve things in the travel and expense reporting system, and maybe you get some soft skills, you know, kind of leadership development stuff. But for the most part, you don't get a really comprehensive program that prepares you to manage people. You probably got promoted because you were pretty good at the job you were doing before. Mm-hmm. So, you know, if I'm going to blow a trumpet, that's where I'm blowing my trumpet is at my managers to help them understand why they're the front line for risk mitigation, how it's important, what's expected of them, and they don't have to do it themselves, right? So often you look at these situations where a manager handled something inappropriately, and it was because they thought they had to handle it themselves, and they didn't really understand the resources that were available to them. So yes, the concerns raised in this question are real. The data supports that they're real. And the place to start making effective change is with your lower level managers.
Thank you for that, Erica. So I know we're 4 minutes shy away from 1 o'clock. So going back to the theme of this special report, Manny and Erica, can you share some final thoughts in terms of how companies can approach risk management as a team sport?
Well, I'll start. I mean, look, I think tone at the top is really important. It's not, you know, it's not only in certain regulations, but it's a reality. If the executive management team is not promoting collaboration across the organization, you're going to have problems. So it has to start there. I think secondly, having an ERM in place that looks at risk comprehensively and establishes the controls by which people can clearly understand, and then having the processes and reporting under it, I think is an important component. And thirdly, just having some frequency to the meetings. You know, I think this concept of relationship building is really important, and having a cadence by which, you know, issues can be discussed, progress can be discussed, action plans can be taken out of those things to show a certain, you know, momentum going meeting to meeting, I think is really important. Those would be the 3 takeaways I would take.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would agree with all those, RT. You know, I would add to Manny's point about tone at the top and ERM, making sure that risk appetite is not just discussed at the executive level, but is communicated. So that people understand how people feel about particular risks, and that there's a general agreement on what the risk appetite is across the organization is something else that I would highlight. I think staying very, very close to changes in the business, right? understanding the strategy of significant changes. So acquisitions, divestitures, entering a market, leaving a market, making sure that that's a part of the conversation. We regularly see, and Manny, I don't know if you see the same thing, but we regularly see control functions like audit or compliance getting caught a little flat-footed and being brought into the conversation later than they otherwise should have been around significant business changes. And so making sure that, that's something that is a part of that conversation, I think, is the other thing I would add.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. I think, look, as we discussed early at the beginning of this conversation, risk management is the flip side of, oftentimes growth plans. And so connecting that to the organization is critical. I mean, we have certain acquisitions in particular geographic territories in the company that are off limits. So then the team knows those are areas that, at least in our 5-year time horizon, we're not going. That creates a lot of clarity. Now, oftentimes, most of the work is in the area of gray, and it's defining that as much as you can helps an organization tremendously.
Great. We're almost close to 1 o'clock. So thank you, Erica and Manny, for an informative presentation, and thanks to those who sent their questions in. Again, that was Manny Conti, Chief Executive Officer at Opus, and Ethisphere's Executive Director of the Business Ethics Leadership Alliance, Erica Salmon-Byrne. Today's topic, risk as a team sport, managing key enterprise risk across functions, and it was brought to you in partnership with Opus. As a reminder, once this presentation wraps, participants will receive an exclusive copy of the Opus and Ethisphere Special Report. This webcast has also been recorded and will be shared via email in the next hour or so. Please feel free to reach out to us for more. This concludes our webcast today. Thank you again for joining us, and goodbye.